The Subcommittee on Europe will come to order. Purpose of this hearing is to discuss the subcommittee's areas of jurisdiction for State Department reauthorization, which includes the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, European and Eurasian Affairs, the Purpose Committee authorization. Purpose of this hearing is to discuss the subcommittee's areas of jurisdiction for State Department reauthorization, which includes the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence and Stability, and the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I want to begin by welcoming both members and witnesses to the Subcommittee on Europe's first hearing on State Department reauthorization. Under the leadership of Chairman Mast, each subcommittee has been assigned different bureaus from across the State Department in order to conduct oversight, explore potential reforms, and to ultimately authorize the bureaus into law. It has been a while since reauthorization was accomplished, and I look forward to working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we move through this important process. It is essential that Congress takes up its responsibility to authorize a State Department that is fully able to execute the mission of making the United States a safer, stronger, and more prosperous country. As this is our first hearing on this subject, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the State Department bureaus this subcommittee will be overseeing in the 119th Congress. The Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence and Stability, also known as ADS, is responsible for diplomatic efforts to increase stability, reduce the risk of unintentional escalation, and prevent conflict. This includes promoting the stability and control of emerging military technologies, including AI and quantum computing, and upholding bans on chemical and biological weapons. ADS also leads negotiations on nuclear arms control and represents the United States in multilateral forums addressing WMD challenges, originally created as the Bureau of Verification and Compliance in 1999. The Bureau's position of Assistant Secretary of State is authorized in statute, and only that one position. Next, we have the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, or ISN, which is the mission of preventing the spread of WMD, delivery systems, and advanced conventional weapons capability. Additionally, ISN works to protect U.S. critical and emerging technology and promotes the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, science, and technology. The Bureau was formed in 2005 by then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice through an agency reorganization effort that combined the Bureau of Non-Proliferation and the Bureau of Arms Control. The Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation is currently not authorized in statute by Congress. The Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, or EUR for short, is responsible for developing and implementing U.S. foreign policy in Europe and Eurasia. The Bureau promotes U.S. interest in the region on issues such as international security, NATO, cooperation with the European Union and other regional organizations, support for democracy, human rights, civil society, economic prosperity, non-proliferation, and counterterrorism. One of the key missions of the Bureau is the planning, coordination, and delivery of assistance to the region. As members of Congress, it is our duty to ensure that every tax dollar spent abroad is achieving U.S. strategic objectives. Like ISN, the Bureau for European and Eurasian Affairs is not authorized in statute. Finally, I want to note that the subcommittee also has jurisdiction over the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, as well as the Export-Import Bank, but these will not be the subject of today's hearing. One of the three bureaus we are discussing today, only one is explicitly authorized, and that only partially. Without clear and concise instruction from Congress through a State Department reauthorization, the legislative branch of government invites the executive to have broad powers to shape the structures, personnel, and mission of agencies. It is my belief that a stronger State Department requires clear legislative guidance from the Congress. As the committee moves through this reauthorization process, the experience and insights from our witnesses today will help guide us in working to build a more efficient and effective State Department. I look forward to hearing your testimony and recommendations. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Self, and thank you for our witnesses being here today. The arms control, nonproliferation, the U.S. foreign assistance to Europe has been at the heart of U.S.-led world order since the end of the Second World War, beginning with President Truman in 1948. The Marshall Plan brought more than $13 billion in investments to European economies, provided the U.S. with significant influence in Europe, and solidified the transatlantic alliance that we all benefit from today. Also born out of the triumph of the Second World War, a modern-day arms control and nonproliferation regimen that's enabled the United States and its adversaries, such as the then Soviet Union, to work together and reduce the risk posed by nuclear weapons. I remember a time where every American feared for their lives during the Cold War, and literally when I had a neighbor a couple of streets over who built a bomb shelter in his yard. The Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, as well as the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability, are critical to ensuring Americans never again live with this fear. But we didn't come here today to discuss history. We came here today to talk about the future of arms control, international security, and foreign assistance to Europe. The Trump administration has said it's pursuing a foreign assistance agenda to make America stronger, safer, and more prosperous. Ostensibly, this includes countering the malign influence of Russia and China. Our foreign assistance to Europe does that. In Europe, countries like Moldova, Georgia, Kosovo, and Armenia are seeking greater U.S. economic cooperation and assistance in bolstering democratic efforts in those areas. In Ukraine, the United States has rebuilt Ukraine's energy grid following the Russian attacks, allowing Ukraine to repel them on the battlefield. Sadly, some of those efforts cut with the cuts to USAID. Yet, while the Trump administration claims to be putting America first, it's actually ceding territory and influence, literally in Ukraine and figuratively throughout the European continent, to Russia and increasingly to China. If the Trump administration was serious about pursuing its stated goals of making America stronger, safer, and more prosperous, restoring all congressionally appropriated foreign assistance funding to our allies in Europe would be the first step in that direction. On arms control and nonproliferation, the ISN and ADS bureaus employ subject matter experts with specialized backgrounds who both verify compliance of our arms control efforts and engage with multilateral institutions to ensure the United States is shaping global norms on these topics, and not Russia, not China, not Iran, not North Korea. Yet the Trump administration has initiated a reduction in force at the State Department, which could target the critical work of the ISN and ADS bureaus and the numerous career civil servants whose expertise is not replaceable. On each of these issues, arms control, nonproliferation, and U.S. assistance to Europe, the Trump administration must do something it's failed to do thus far. It has to show up. To counter Russian and Chinese malign influence, the Trump administration must show up and provide necessary funding for countries like Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, who are striving to maintain and expand their democracies. The Trump administration is serious about arms control and nonproliferation efforts. The administration must show up to multilateral institutions and our bilateral partners and engage proactively. Unfortunately, its effort to fire hundreds of civil and foreign service officers with deep expertise in these issues runs counter to these goals. And if the Trump administration wants to pursue such drastic changes in U.S. policy, it must show up to Congress. While I appreciate our witnesses' presence here today, the lack of administrative engagement with this committee and the ceding of Article I power by this committee and this Republican majority not only undermines the role of the legislative branch, but it harms U.S. national security at this critical time in history. I'll end with this. In 1994, the Budapest Agreement, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a security guarantee from the United States, Russia, and Britain. Russia obviously abandoned that promise long ago. Over the last few weeks, Donald Trump has also broken our promise and won't even acknowledge Russia's aggression. Of course, agreements mean nothing if not enforced, and Trump's actions undercut the credibility of our country. Moments ago, after this hearing started, Ukraine and President Zelensky agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. I hope that that ceasefire is backed up with security guarantees as well, or again, they'll mean nothing. Now Ukraine has likely come to regret their decision to give up those weapons. President Zelensky is now asking allies for strong security guarantees, such as those guaranteed by a nuclear umbrella to deter Russia and its horrific aggression and war crimes. Abandoning our allies in Europe will undermine our allies' belief that the United States is a strong, dependable ally, and this only emboldens China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. If we want to remain a global leader in arms control, nonproliferation, and transatlantic relationships, the United States must show up, and we must lead. I look forward to our witness testimony, and I yield the balance of my time.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. We have the Honorable Yleem Poblete, PhD, Dr. Poblete, former Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance, U.S. State Department. Mr. Daniel Kochis, Senior Fellow, Hudson Institute, and Ambassador James O'Brien, former Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Europe and Europe-Asia Affairs, Department of State. This chair recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have your presence here to speak with us. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for our members to have questions. I now recognize Dr. Poblete for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I provide specific, detailed recommendations, a plethora of them, in my prepared remarks on potential reforms for the arms control and international security family at the Department of State, otherwise known as the T family. But I would like to address some overarching issues. First, for American leadership to endure and facilitate and contribute to security and peace, we must be strong militarily, economically, and diplomatically. This means perhaps doing more with less. It is something that we were required to do when I was a staffer on this committee, and it is something that can and will be done. That also begins by placing the security and well-being of the American people and our nation first and aligning all of our efforts toward that goal. But this does not mean America alone. The U.S. under President Trump supports alliances. Alliances denote that there is an alignment of interest. It denotes that there is an equal stake and equal contributions toward the shared goals of the alliance members. For decades, multilateralism has been viewed as an end unto itself without rigorous or careful examination of the mandate, functions, and relevance of multinational organizations in addressing the current political and threat environment. Such a review is integral to any effort to transform our policies and government to advance U.S. security and interests and leave the U.S. well-positioned for current and future challenges. To Ranking Member Keaton's point about the U.S. showing up, the U.S. definitely shows up in more ways than just foreign aid. In my areas of jurisdiction and when I was at the State Department, we show up via Aegis ashore sites in Europe, via U.S. Navy ships with Aegis ballistic missile defense capabilities and systems. We show up with Patriot systems in the European theater, as well as other support. This all through the U.S.-European phased adaptive approach to the defense of the European theater. I, too, firmly believe that the work of the T family, where diplomacy, intelligence, and defense converge, is an essential tool in the U.S. arsenal of national security instruments of power. It embodies peace through strength, including via verification and compliance, strategic dialogues, deterrence, missile defense policy, and assistance for nonproliferation efforts. I'm sharing a few of the observations included in my prepared remarks, some unpleasant, but we are all seeking to improve our capabilities. As Assistant Secretary for Verification and Compliance, I had the opportunity to indeed work with some brilliant, dedicated, forward-thinking professionals and faithful public servants and patriots in this space, but also observed others pining for and operating in a distant past or seized by nativism, losing focus of U.S. interests, priorities, and objectives. The Eurocentrism, Eurodominance, stemming from Cold War dynamics, arms treaties, and agreements, has led to the usurpation of some key family responsibilities, including those statutorily required. The utilization by the intelligence community of findings and assessments by international organizations instead of providing U.S. intelligence. Manipulation of clearance processes to usurp statutory roles and authorities of decision makers and advance personal agendas. Examples include scope, content determinations relating to the compliance report, specifically with respect to Iran, personnel in the Office of the Legal Advisor reversing previously clear determinations and approved language on such matters as violations of UN Security Council resolutions, and Assistant Secretary level clearances changed before they reached the Secretary's desk. Some of the recommendations. To succeed in reforming, realigning, streamlining, and optimizing, there must be clear guidance and leadership on agenda priorities and scope. This applies to undersecretaries, bureaus, offices, up the chain of command to the Secretary, and it should also guide the authorization process. We need clear lines of demarcation, transparency and honesty in reporting, stop overclassification to hide information from the Congress or the American people, particularly when data is in the public domain. Return to unclassified reports with classified TSSCI annexes as mandated by statute. No versions of intermediate classification. Dramatically increase the scope of the compliance report in terms of the subject matter covered and information used to inform the judgments and document. Optimization. T has to be fully integrated. No marginalization or subordination to regional bureaus. The T should reflect the current landscape in scope and message as potentially the Undersecretary for Global Security and Strategic Domains. This includes outer space, undersea, AI, and cyber. Eliminate congressional and public affairs offices and personnel within bureaus, as all these requests should go through the department's respective bureaus and offices to ensure maximum coordination and message cohesion. Bring matters pertaining to the Antarctic Treaty, Arctic Affairs, Artemis Accords given based on the Outer Space Treaty, space traffic management already handled by the ADS Bureau, the ESC office of that bureau, to a revamped and renamed ADS Bureau. Funds and assistance programs should be consolidated into one dedicated office, not an additional office, but one office dedicated to such funding and oversight, similar to regional bureaus. Other eliminations, consolidations, and reductions, including in structure, personnel, and functions, are included in my prepared testimony. In sum, we are being called to do what is right and necessary, not what is easy or popular. I look forward to your questions and to working together to make the Department of State, foreign policy, and programs more efficient, and in the hope of ushering in a new era of American leadership and greatness while advancing security and peace for the U.S., the American people, and worldwide. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Poblete. I now recognize Mr. Kochis as his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic. My name is Daniel Kochis. I am a senior fellow in the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to offer my testimony this afternoon. Please note that the views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be necessarily construed as those representing the Hudson Institute. The last comprehensive foreign relations reauthorization bill was enacted into law over 20 years ago. At that moment, Vladimir Putin had only been in office for 2 years, It would be 3 more before he gave voice to his belief that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. The invasion of Georgia and Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and Moscow's systematic shadow war against the U.S. and its allies waited in the future. In 2002, Russia was in fact the 4th largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving nearly $1/4 of U.S. dollars dispersed that fiscal year in the Europe and Eurasia region. The U.S., still reeling from the 9/11 attacks, had successfully convinced allies to deploy alongside us to Afghanistan. The push to focus NATO on out-of-area operations was underway, a decision that in retrospect has proven foolish and from which Europe continues to recover. In 2002, we retained a unipolar moment. The year following, the Chinese Navy counted 128 vessels, 100 less than the United States. Today, China is the world's largest navy with 370 ships and submarines. The world was still 11 years away from the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's plan for massive infrastructure investment in order to link Beijing economically and politically to key global regions, including prominently in Eastern Europe. Today, the world is a very different place. As Congress undertakes this reauthorization effort, the watchword I believe should be at the forefront of your minds is competition, principally against our great power adversaries, China and Russia. Reorienting State Department resources for the current era of great power competition is a necessary task which will help steer U.S. policy toward accomplishing the most important outcomes. Prying one great power adversary from the other is, in my view, simply not possible. The shared Sino-Russian goal of insulating their illegitimate regimes and forcibly bringing an end to the Western-led global order and, by extension, decreasing U.S. power and influence has bonded Beijing and Moscow in a way which U.S. diplomacy will be unable to overcome. Therefore, we simply need to compete. This being a competition the U.S. cannot afford to lose, we must leverage every tool in our arsenal to maximize our advantages. One of those more potent tools we have is foreign aid. When thinking through this assistance, the driving factor should always be the question, does this advance U.S. national interests? There are clear examples during the past few years of U.S. foreign aid dollars funding projects which do not advance this interest clearly. These, while glaring, are nonetheless minor components in the overall foreign aid program. In the 20th century, Nicholas Skymon wrote, "Who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world." Today, this rimland, which includes the majority of continental Europe, is hotly contested. It is more important than ever that the U.S. remain active in the region, with the State Department focusing its efforts on 3 key areas. Those where U.S. support is crucial, those where the U.S. has a strong comparative advantage, and finally, geographic areas or points of interest where they are on the cusp of magnified significance. The Balkans, for example, fulfill components of all 3 of these focus areas. It is once again on the cusp of returning to top geopolitical relevance. U.S. support remains crucial, and there are components of needed support, particularly in the energy sphere, where the U.S. has significant comparative advantages. As the committee thinks through the framework of State Department priorities, staffing, and oversight, I would also suggest a greater focus on the Arctic, one region which is clearly on the cusp of heightened significance in the decades ahead. Finally, I would note the imperative to focus our efforts on those nations where our adversaries are targeting their attention, places like Moldova and Ukraine. Residing in the unenviable gray zone, these countries find themselves in critical need of our support. Continued U.S. prosperity and security lie in no small part upon ensuring stability in Europe. As such, it is advantageous to remain engaged in this theater. Foreign aid, if utilized prudently in service of the national interest, can help bolster positive outcomes in the region, block our adversaries from gaining undue influence, and provide an excellent return on investment for U.S. policymakers. Thank you. With that, I look forward to answering your questions and shedding any light I can on this subject matter at hand this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Kochis. I now recognize Ambassador O'Brien for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I've spent half my career in the private sector and half at the State Department. And what I've noticed are a couple things. One is that EUR is the gateway to most global issues. Any caucus or group that addresses a global issue runs through our relationships with our transatlantic partners. The P3 at the UN, NATO itself, all the significant organizations, including the informal ones like the G7 and others. So we have to get that right. That's why EUR ends up doing silly measurements like much more than half the paper that goes to the Secretary of State, because it's that relationship that's the bedrock of all other functions in the State Department. The second thing is the State Department's always in a state of transition. Every year, a third of FSOs change over. Politicals like us kind of come and go every couple of years. Experts get hired. And even the civil service is facing an enormous transition as baby boomers hit retirement age. So the impact of that is that it's pretty easy to get your priorities in place in the State Department without a lot of barking like an angry dog about how the workforce is wrong. And I think what it takes is clear leadership, a set of criteria, and an approach that makes sense to the American people and that workers can follow. And I fear, frankly, Mr. Chairman, we don't have that now. Four points. One of them just goes to what's the role of this process. So Secretary Rubio and Mr. Musk seem to have settled their disagreement by agreeing that now 83% of AID contracts can get canceled. And as always, the powerful have settled their dispute on the backs of people without voices. So there's American farmers waiting on $2.6 billion of payments by AID, and those have been disrupted. I don't know if they'll be paid. There are tens of millions of people depending on healthcare and food that was delivered through AID projects. And now that they're not getting that, they're either going to die or they're going to migrate. This is the most effective border security program we've got, and we just took it to zero. Now, the most significant element of this, though, is that each of these projects came up, of course, to this committee and 3 other committees for approval before the money went out the door. And the Secretary of State has now said that this committee was wrong on $4 out of $5 in the foreign assistance account. That's a pretty poor batting average. And I think what we need to do is find some way in which the administration can make clear what it intends to spend money on so that this committee can reach agreement, and then the president can agree that he'll take care to follow the authorization law once it's enacted, as opposed to asserting a unilateral prerogative to impound the money. And as you go through that, I hope you ask 3 questions. One of them is, how does any restructuring advance the president's objectives? Just to take one example, on arms control, every major agreement has been led by the U.S., and much of that expertise sits in ADS. So if we just start firing people, we won't be able to accomplish the kind of reductions the president says he wants in nuclear weapons. Second major question, can we get others to spend more money? We talk a lot about burden sharing in the military capacity. Here are others. In Ukraine, the United States spent, the AID, about $350 million on Ukrainian agriculture. This contributed to tens of billions of dollars that Ukraine spent on its own military. It also led that $350 million to $2.2 billion in private sector investment by American companies. AID also spent the money to help Ukraine get this grain out. If we want access to Ukrainian critical minerals, those things are going to have to transit Poland, for the most part, and maybe Romania, 2 countries we're kind of alienating right now. So I don't understand how what we're doing allows us to get others to contribute more. Third major question is, are we mortgaging the future? Our kids are going to get rich or get poor based on developments in artificial intelligence, biomedical sciences, and energy efficiency. The Chinese are trying to write the global standards in those areas. If we stand with our European partners, along with Japan, Korea, and some others, we will be more populous, more wealthy, and more experienced at writing the global standards that our companies will sell into. If we try to do this on our own, sending others off to do it on their own, we fight China at a disadvantage. That's mortgaging the future. Another area is the defense industry. The supplemental appropriation for Ukraine spent more than $30 billion in U.S. companies. Now, the Europeans are about to spend tens, maybe hundreds of billions, 2/3 of which they would spend with U.S. companies, but they are going to direct it to their own companies. Those are jobs that will not be in your districts, even if American companies get European contracts. We're mortgaging the future. So I hope you can put those questions, and I hope the administration shows up to provide clear answers, because with that, it's easy to address the structural issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador O'Brien. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Dr. Poblete, does the current structure of the T family reflect the current threat environment while looking at the future to adapt to any authorities, structure, and programs that we need to change to address emerging threats?
Small components of the T family are dedicated to emerging security challenges, but its current construct is primarily focused on nuclear arms control and agreements and structures that no longer exist or are just a modicum of what was needed at the time. So in sum, yes, it does advance U.S. interests. It does align with our America First priorities, but in order to adapt, it needs to become leaner, and only the best people need to be there. We need to eliminate redundancy. We need to, as I specified in my oral remarks and my prepared remarks, we need to avoid duplication, and that leads to waste of time, energy, and resources. So we need to have clear lines of demarcation. In our conversation prior to this hearing, you asked if it would be possible to merge the International Security Nonproliferation Bureau, ISN, with ADS, statutorily verification and compliance. My first instinct was we are able to, and I provide specifics, we are able to distill both bureaus down to perhaps 5 or 6 offices. We are able to consolidate functions that are overlapping among the offices in these bureaus. But I do caution, going back to statutory mandate and the history of the genesis of the Verification and Compliance Bureau in T, of the merging of negotiations, assistance, funds with the verification and compliance. When I worked on the committee with the former chairman Ross Leighton, Ranking Member Keating was very supportive of modifying the Atomic Energy Act and the pattern and the method in which we approve 1, 2, 3 agreements, nuclear cooperation agreements. I propose that that is valuable for ISN, but verification and compliance must be integrated into the verification and compliance of nuclear cooperation agreements as well, and ensure that there is accountability if there is cheating even on those civilian nuclear cooperation agreements, because they inform also all our efforts with respect to deterrence, defense, collaboration, partnerships, and the like.
Okay, thank you. Dr. O'Brien, USAID, what does that stand for?
Agency for International Development.
Ah, I thought so. Agency for International Development. You gave us 2 examples of USAID providing money for Americans. I think that's one of the things that this committee will try to get to, although USAID is not in our portfolio, but I needed to address that.
Yeah.
So, Mr.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the tension, Mr. Chairman.
The tension is it's for international development.
Right, by Americans. In this case, I mean, people need food. We can buy the food on the market. We can buy it from Americans.
No, it's international development. We need to correct the USAID, and I think Senator, now Secretary of State Rubio, intends to do that. Mr. Kochis, I have less than a minute. The Balkans are vital to this committee. I think they're a potential flashpoint, and you mentioned energy and the Russian influence, of course, in Serbia. Can you elaborate on your view of how we become an energy partner? And you've got 30 seconds.
Well, I completely agree. I think not just Russian, but also Chinese investment in energy in the Balkans has expanded quite significantly. I think in two ways. One, of course, is U.S. natural gas, trying to help those nations in that region build out their interconnections. And I think the other is nuclear. So helping to leverage our expertise in the nuclear sphere, I think will improve the energy picture there, and also some of the air quality issues and the sort of life issues that they have in the region, which are impacted by the heavy use of coal.
Thank you. I yield, and I now recognize Ranking Member Keating for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I think in Ukraine that myself, I understand Putin's rhetoric, and I believe some belief that what he envisions is a reconstitution of the old Soviet Union. But I think his real concern in Ukraine has been right next door to him will be a country rich with young, educated, technologically expert young people that will become entrepreneurs. I think he's worried that the breadbasket of the world is right next door, and that economic influence. I know he's concerned about the potential for Ukraine's own military-industrial development itself. And to have that prospering country in a democracy right next door, while the Russian economy continues to go in the tank, and he's driven it further with his illegal war in Ukraine, serves as a contrast that would create a great domestic political problem for himself, let alone cutting out the oligarchs that are a part of his network of self-wealth that many people say makes him the wealthiest person in the world. It's a mafia-like crime syndicate, as it's been discussed. So it's that comparison. Ambassador O'Brien, I traveled with you to Ukraine. When I was there, I met with the American-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. And I was just struck by the businesses, the U.S. businesses that are there, how they made it through this war, continued, and how they wanted to grow beyond this. They realized all the things I just said about Ukraine being the powerhouse, really, of Europe down the road, and how that not only helps our own business interests here at home, but also strengthens our security here at home. So investing in international development is indeed investing in our own priorities here in the United States. Can you talk a little bit more about how the U.S. interests, make America safer, more prosperous, and also this idea that people have, and I understand if this is all they know, that, we're giving money to other countries when we could use the money back here at home. It's my belief that investing over there has a multiplying effect in terms of investing at home. Could you talk about that?
You answer first, and then
No, Ambassador, because we traveled there and I met with those people.
I was in Ukraine 8 times during the war. I think I don't have an exact multiple for how much U.S. assistance comes back to help us. But I know, for example, that we had a large program to improve the environment for small and medium businesses with a real focus on American companies. They were already beginning to invest substantially in the Ukrainian defense industrial base, and they were beginning to invest in EU countries where inputs would come from Ukraine and then be exported elsewhere in the world. And those are direct benefits to our economy. They also help us, again, as Mr. Kochis and I both emphasized, the real struggle ahead is with China, which hasn't featured much in the last 5 weeks. And I think we're a lot better off if we have that as our focus and we build our base in just the way you all do when you run. You get your base together, and our base sits with our European partners, Japan, Korea, and some others. With that, we're 1 billion to 1.5 billion people. For Ukraine to inject another 35 million young, well-educated people with enormous resources into our base helps us with the real struggle that's ahead. And that's part of what's at stake here.
And I really appreciate the comments of our other witnesses, too, highlighting other areas where this will be important, too. Like the Balkans, like the Arctic. These are areas where it's critical. And we are in competition with China in those areas. And it's this investment in Ukraine that's going to strengthen that. Our moving away from that does just the opposite. So whether it's the Balkans, whether it's up north, whether it's these areas of influence, whether it's our overall strategy with China has been one of deterrence, that's our strategy, this is weakened as well. So when you look at this front line and you look at that investment, I don't know how you can't help but understand, and it's up to us as representative people to better communicate to people in our districts and across the country that this is indeed the America First policy. I yield back.
And now recognize the representative from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I thank our witnesses. I appreciate you being here today to answer questions. Mr. O'Brien, you spent some time with the Biden administration. What does the phrase, are you familiar with the phrase, as much as it takes, as long as it takes? Yep. What, so you are familiar with it. What does that phrase mean? As much as it takes, we're clear of that, just keep cutting the checks. As long as it takes to do what? They never would define the mission. What's the mission as you see it?
Well, no, I think we did, and I think it goes to some of the difficulties I have with the decisions.
No,
on
you
funding.
didn't. And the reality is Victoria.
I don't think you're right there.
Well, let me elaborate since
Please
it's my
do.
time. Victoria Nuland said that it was regime change in Russia, including war crimes tribunals for Vladimir Putin.
When did she say that?
I don't have the date. I'll be glad to supply it for
Why don't you
since,
supply
since
that
it's
to
my
me?
job to question you.
Yeah, okay.
So what was it exactly that you believe that the administration committed to do in Ukraine?
Yeah, so what
Besides spend money.
Okay, sorry, my turn. What we were working toward during my time as Assistant Secretary was to build a viable ceasefire. Much of that work was spent with the Ukrainians, so they were prepared to do that. The Russians were unwilling to make a ceasefire on any terms that would be sustainable.
Okay, so I appreciate that. You wanted to secure peace, and that's good, because then you should be euphoric that President Trump has come in and said, the United States of America is very happy to help you secure peace. But
I agree with the
there's
goal.
not a lot of happiness in the world from the Biden administration. It's, oh, how dare you not keep cutting the checks? And that generally is the theme within the State Department, is they'll share just enough information to get Congress to shut up and cut the checks. Right? I'm not having a discussion with you, please. I don't plan to talk to you again.
That was never
You can turn your
my
mic off.
attitude.
I'm not talking to you anymore.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the reality of what's been going on for a long time. People come to Congress and say, just cut the checks. And frankly, what you see out of the European Union, we couldn't get them to cut the checks for a long time. You know, some of the smaller countries did contribute. A lot of countries contributed a little more, but your big countries like Germany continue to not meet their obligations under NATO. They gave statements about meeting their obligations, but they didn't meet their obligations to NATO. And now that Donald Trump has said, all right, fine, you'll find out. You're not ready for peace? Go ahead. Suddenly, the Europeans have found the resolve to spend money. I just want to share a quote from Irving Kristol, a godfather of the neoconservative movement. He said in 1983, well before the end of the Cold War, he said, quote, if we have learned anything from the NATO experience of the last 30 years, that was, in 1983, it is the rediscovery of an old truth. Dependency corrupts, and absolute dependency corrupts absolutely. The culture of entitlement and dependence on American money has corrupted many of our allies, and it's nice to see it changing. When we look at our own approach, though, we've had a hard time saying, what's in it for America? Why should America serve as the de facto European defense force and then continue to be treated with contempt for it? Victoria Nuland had her own problems, but when we look at the acting ambassador there, we should have some other concerns. So, Ms. Poblete, you're familiar with some of the challenges from your time in the Ledge branch. Does it resonate with you that we're kept in the dark in a lot of things just so we cut the checks?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it was crystallized during my time at the Department of State just to what great lengths some individuals go to hide information from the Congress. But to your point, Congressman Davidson, and the discussion of foreign aid. Foreign aid needs to have clearly defined goals and objectives. With respect to Ukraine, that never really occurred. When Senator Rand Paul sought a GAO report to ascertain how the funding had been used, who were the end users, was it used for the intended purposes that the Congress had appropriated and authorized it for, he was called an agent of Putin.
Yeah,
He
that's
was
the
called
standard attack. Is if you
Exactly.
don't just cut the checks, you're an enemy of the state, the deep state maybe. And that's where you look at Bridget Brink. She's actually worked to get rid of the prosecutor that was going to look in Ukraine into Hunter Biden, who was going to look into things that we should have an interest in, that we should have accountability. Because what's lacking when you're kept in the dark is accountability. And that's exactly what the Biden administration worked to avoid on every front.
And if I may, sir, if I could share with all the members of
The
this
gentleman's
committee.
time, the gentleman's time is up. I now recognize the representative from Rhode Island, Mr. Ammo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Focusing on some things that matter, let's talk about President Trump and his direction to Elon Musk to use Doge to take a chainsaw to our government. This has resulted in thousands of federal employees being fired. These sweeping layoffs have been willful and malicious. Adding to the chaos and confusion, laid off workers have had their terminations rescinded once Elon realized the dangerous consequences of his actions. So it's clear that Doge has no idea how our government works, yet that hasn't stopped them from forging ahead on their rampage. I underscore rampage. Every agency has been directed to submit a report on plans to further reduce their workforce by this Thursday. Thankfully, the State Department hasn't had the mass layoffs of other agencies like USAID, apparently a point of contention between Elon and Secretary Rubio. However, there is a list of about 700 civil servants who could be fired circulating at the agency. And in the last 2 months alone, another 700 employees have resigned, nearly as many as typically resign in an entire year. So make no mistake, these proposed layoffs and forced resignations of dedicated public servants threaten our national security. It brings me to two subjects of today's hearing: the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation and the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability, AKA the experts who work to prevent nuclear war and international arms trafficking. And I hope that everybody agrees that we'd be better off by having long-serving, experienced civil servants working at these bureaus. They leverage their institutional knowledge to keep us safe. Look, after all, we're talking about nuclear arms control agreements, monitoring chemical weapons, protecting critical American innovation, and coordinating global cooperation to prevent terrorists from accessing sensitive technology. This doesn't sound like entry-level work to me. It sounds like it requires a deep understanding of these technologies and our international agreements built on years of experience. So, Ambassador O'Brien, briefly, can you tell me a bit how firing or forcing the resignation of staff within these bureaus would harm our national security and our ability to prevent bad actors from accessing nuclear weapons and other advanced technologies?
Sure. I think there are a couple of things. So one is, the chairman asked about new technologies. So certainly in the ISN Bureau, I worked with them a lot on restricting access of bad actors to new technologies. The set of expertise that's available there on supply chains and the financing of trade in items that can lead to dangerous weapons is second to none and enables us to keep ourselves secure. And I saw again and again how we were able to restrict Russian, Iranian, and North Korean access to these items because of the expertise in that bureau. A recent thing that we were just able to sort of push over the line in my last couple of months there was the arrival of this shadow fleet, a group of unregulated tankers that export Venezuelan, Iranian, and Russian oil, competing unfairly with American producers and avoiding sanctions. We were finally able, largely because of the expertise of people in that bureau and in EUR, to identify the kind of key nodes where those ships intersect with the global commerce. And we're able to get the key states that have ability to access them either in ports or in straits to shut it down. More broadly here, it brings other countries along. So ISN in particular, but also ADS, work with all of the other countries that have an interest in the more sophisticated parts of the supply chain for weapons, but also implementation of any kind of effective ceasefire arrangement. All that expertise sits there. Now, is it all as up to date as we would want? Again, there's enormous turnover in these places. And I think somebody needs to really dig in and see who works there now. ADS hired during the time I was assistant secretary a number of very experienced people in working on issues like AI, crypto, other ways in which bad actors try to come at our security. And I think if somebody takes the time to dig in, you may find that you don't need sort of broad structural changes, but you can actually just give clear direction. And that's what we're lacking right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. Quickly, before my time expires, President Trump isn't just weakening our national security by firing federal employees. He's detonating our relationships around the world. By freezing foreign assistance, our credibility with countries is being jeopardized. I look at countries like Armenia that has been moving closely to strengthening ties with the United States. So, as I wrap up here, the message that we're sending is one that's detrimental to our commitment to countries like Armenia who need us to be committed in this relationship as we move further. I yield back.
I now recognize the representative from California, Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman Self and Ranking Member Keating, for holding today's hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. And good to see you. Good to see you, Dr. Philippe. It's been a while. Increasing stability, preventing conflict, and preserving and advancing effective arms control and disarmament measures are the core of ADS's mission. And we've repeatedly seen Russia reject U.S. proposals for talks concerning an arms control framework after the expiration of START. Additionally, I'm deeply concerned about the PRC's accelerated nuclear weapons programs amidst its escalating rhetoric. So can you talk to us about what ways can ADS be better positioned to work bilaterally and multilaterally to pursue effective nuclear risk reduction dialogue?
Thank you. It's great to see you. If the congressman has left, but if I could start by making a couple of points. Number one, with respect to DOGE, how many members of this committee would not have loved to have had a tool similar to that, uncovering? But the ultimate decision makers are the Secretary of State, confirmed by the Senate, comes from the Congress. So it is just a tool. It is not conducting a rampage. President Trump himself has recognized the value of experts in the ISN and AVC Bureau, not specifically, but talking about how there are many good people. We want to retain the best of the best. But that does not mean that these two bureaus require over 300 individuals to keep the very best, the most knowledgeable experts to engage in negotiations of arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament agreements and treaties.
Not to be redundant, but is there a certain line of technical or scientific expertise that would prove beneficial if added to ADS?
We have the current technical, military, intel, and scientific expertise. Ironically, and that's part of my recommendations, ironically, these bureaus are overwhelmed by policy experts, by messaging experts. So if we were to reduce the personnel and reduce the scope to those who have the hands-on expertise overseen by policy and expert negotiators, that would go a long way to being more efficient and more successful in our arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament negotiations.
Thank you. And you also mentioned in your testimony that about the Eurocentrism and Euro-dominance stemming from Cold War dynamics, arms treaties and agreements has undermined some T family responsibilities relating to verification and compliance. So what can be done to ensure this trend does not continue?
Again, the Teese family and the undersecretary needs to be treated equally to her P counterpart, for example. And statute must be the overarching guide, which means, according to the congressional report, not just the statute, but congressional intent made it clear that no regional bureau was to supersede determinations made by the Verification and Compliance Bureau when it came to those functions. And further, with respect to the reference to sanctions and Treasury, that intelligence is actually gathered primarily by the Department of the Treasury. And all bureaus at the Department of State are engaged in those determinations to impose sanctions. But with respect to the Euro dominance and Eurocentrism, if we want to counter China, as we did in the 45th administration and as we want to do again now, yes, a lot goes through Europe just because historically that is the case, but we cannot overly focus on just Europe. To counter China, we must empower every regional bureau and every bureau of the Department of State using all elements of U.S. power, not just those going through Europe.
Chairman, I have a few more questions, but I'm running out of time. Do I have?
We'll have a second round. I now recognize the representative from Nevada, Madam Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, like some of my colleagues, I'm appalled by Trump's actions to freeze all of U.S. foreign aid, abandon the USAID working professionals around the country and their families, and dismantling the federal workforce generally. These steps have led to unnecessary deaths for those people who count on programs that we have been involved with in health care, the financial hardship and uncertainty for our Foreign Service officers, and diminished U.S. credibility. I've just met with some representatives from Europe earlier today, and they're kind of appalled. They don't really know how to react to having someone who's been their friend now not only not be a friend, but possibly be an enemy. I'm particularly concerned about the rolling back of democracy programs that existed with USAID. You know, we were there to support countries where there were new democracies that were building and established democracies that were backsliding. We built a vibrant civil society communities. We backed up the free press. We not only were supporting our own values, but we were backing up China and Russia, and if we're not there, they're going to step in to fill the void. The Republicans love to do a list of the things that USAID does that they hate, so I'd like to do a list of some of the pro-democracy programs that have been eliminated or frozen. Program to support Belarus democratic leaders in exile, advancing Belarus democracy. Program funding election monitoring in Kosovo, advancing digital democracy in Serbia, promoting the development of independent professional media in Moldova, fostering more responsive governance in Armenia, boosting civil society engagement in Georgia, supporting political pluralism in Bosnia-Herzegovina. These are the kind of programs that are our soft power, that we not only further the values that we have, but it also helps our national security. And if we don't believe that, the minute these were frozen, you saw Bruno Rodriguez praising this, Medvedev saying, oh, this is great, applause around the world for us being gone so they could step in. So that's what I'd like for us to address. And I'd ask you, Mr. O'Brien, looking at the Western Balkans, there have been a lot of programs there that have been terminated, and not just those that were focused on democracy like I mentioned, but some things like promoting energy security, combating corruption, strengthening critical infrastructure. Could you talk a little bit about how Russia will see it as an advantage if we're not there with those programs?
Yeah, it already does. So Russia supplies a critical amount of gas, less and less, to Serbia and on into Bosnia and elsewhere. The Serbs have announced they would like to get to zero, but for that to happen, they need American natural gas to become available. That will come either through a pipeline that runs up from basically Greece through North Macedonia, or it would come through a pipeline that runs through Croatia and across Bosnia. Now, that pipeline is stuck because of corruption, which is tied to two local leaders, one of whom actively presents himself as the local affiliate of the administration and is actively trying to get out from under sanctions because of his corruption. So we're now eliminating the programs that will clear the way for America to become a reliable energy supplier and free these countries from Russian influence. I have trouble seeing that as an America First agenda.
I completely agree. Well, how about Moldova, things that are happening in Moldova? Would you address that?
Yeah, so Moldova, like a lot of countries from Central Asia all the way across to the Black Sea, these countries want much less Russia. They see this as their chance to get out from under. And in Moldova, there was a small enclave that Russia used to run guns and money laundering operations out around the world. That has become incredibly weakened as a result of the last few years of sanctions. Russia now, facing elections this fall in Moldova, Russia has gone on a massive spree of disinformation, which also affects Romania because of the language, vote buying, and efforts to influence the Moldovan elections by using energy, which they used to supply. So we were building networks to get into Ukraine and also providing the ability for Moldova to generate its own power, but also run power in from Europe. Much of that's gone now, and we're going to leave Moldova at the behest of Russia, which will reinstate its gun-running, thug-running operation again.
Again, not in our best interest. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ranking Member Keating, also wonderful.
Mr. Chairman, could you repeat your introduction again, please?
Yes, we have set the standard on the floor of the House, and I'm simply.
What is that standard, Mr. Chairman?
The
Would you
standard-
repeat what you just said when you introduced a duly elected representative from the United States of America? Please.
I will. The representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Mr. Chairman, you are out of order. Mr. Chairman, have you no decency? I've come to know you a little bit, but this is not decent.
We will continue this.
You
hearing.
will not continue it with me unless you introduce a duly elected representative the right way.
This hearing is adjourned.